Hi, I'm Neinel. The title of my project is Stuck in Crisis, the perceived residual impacts of the 1988 earthquake on life in Spitak, Armenia. Before I proceed, I would like to speak about the current situation with COVID-19. Although the pandemic is on a much larger scale, I have noticed some commonalities between my participants' experiences of the earthquake and that of ours with the pandemic. Our experiences are heavily embedded in financial struggles and uncertainty. Many individuals are dependent on business loans, stimulus checks, unemployment, as they deal with the increasing number of losses nationwide. While we stay at home, we can't help but to wait for things to go back to normal, like they were before the pandemic or pre-COVID. Being in such a state for even a few months has been extremely challenging. Sadly, my field site is a city that has been waiting for life to go back to normal for over 32 years. Spitak is in Armenia, a small country southwest of Russia. The northern regions of Armenia, now called the Belt of Tragedy, suffered extensive damages as a result of an earthquake which occurred on December 7th of 1988 at around 11:41 a.m. As a result, nearly 80% of the buildings were demolished and roughly 50,000 individuals were killed within this belt. Spitak, which is pinned on this map, suffered the destruction of all but four structures due to its proximity to the epicenter. This tragedy gained global attention and foreign aid rushed to Armenia for support. Meanwhile, researchers assess the prevalence of psychological disorders within the post-earthquake population. While their findings show a community heavily impacted by tragedy and loss, their assessment assumed a singular etiology, or the earthquake, to which all recorded outcomes were contributed to. Rather, this project attends to the coalescence of two historically significant events and their residual impacts, which contributed to the prevalence of daily hardship and poverty, resulting in a continuous state of post-disaster recovery in Spitak. The aim of this project was to focus on the lived experiences and perceived impacts of the lengthy recovery process. How did the survivors, not the psychologists, but the survivors and their descendants think about the disaster and its impact on their daily lives? To conduct my fieldwork, I spent a total of 14 weeks in the summer and winter of 2019 in a neighborhood called Italakan, meaning Italian. I relied on semi-structured interviews and participant observation as I spent the majority of my time with two surviving families. In addition to 30 residents, I also interviewed experts for their professional opinions on living conditions in Spitak. During my fieldwork, I lived in a temporary shelter, like my participants, to be able to better understand their living circumstances. To give you a background, these temporary shelters or pop-up structures are called domiks. They were brought over by the Italians during the wave of foreign aid to serve as temporary shelters for the most impacted families, until permanent solutions were made possible. There are over 600 recorded families that live in such domiks throughout Spitak today. You can see the process of establishment and the transformation of these domiks as they overstay their welcome in Armenia. They were originally meant to last only 2 years, but as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union, many recovery projects were left unfinished, and thus many survivors were left to call these temporary solutions their permanent homes. So before the survivors could recover from the catalysm and the aftershocks, there was a political earthquake that eventually resulted in Armenia's separation from the Soviet Union and declaration of independence in 1991. Although survivors can speak of the two events singularly, when they share the temporality of their life experiences, they amalgamate the earthquake and the collapse of communism. The two coalesced events rewrote Spitak's historical timeline and divided life into two time periods, pre- and post-earthquake. As a beekeeper explained, in ordinary life, when you say something, you say on the year of the earthquake, after the earthquake, until the earthquake, it's always marked earthquake, unquote. The past is perceived by survivors as a time of productivity, prosperity, and social and economic mobility, which can be attributed to Armenia's membership to the Soviet Union, while the present is considered to be in a state of economic and social stagnation. The sketch buildings on the image represent historic Spitak, an economic capital where dozens of factories manufactured products to supply the country as well as other Soviet nations. While the earthquake destroyed many structures, the fall of the communism took away the internal trade market which existed within the Soviet Union. Although a few factories were rebuilt after the earthquake, they did not last since the Soviet trade market no longer existed. At the moment, there is not a single factory operating. Joblessness, a non-existent issue in the past, is now a daily threat in every household. Instead of factories, now there are banks. The reliance on bank loans was noticeably excessive and a universal issue for Spitak's residents. Although downtown Spitak is fairly small, there were 5 banks and 2 loan offices. The high number of banks in the heart of the city are structural symbols. The banks are what pump the blood or the resources into the outstretched limbs of the city. As the life support of Spitak, the city cannot survive without the banks. With such strong dependency and reliance on temporary solutions for the lack of stable income, the residents of Spitak are unable to build an economic capital for themselves, to save or to invest. A florist who had to relocate her flower shop to make room for a new loan office in the heart of town compared the fast growth of banks to that of fungi. She said, "Banks grow like mushrooms here." Most fungi can multiply on death and decay as they latch onto trees. Spitak's financial stagnancy can be compared to this decay. On my second visit to the field site in December, this loan office was fully operating and a new loan office was under construction less than 25 meters away. Dahila is a key participant in my study. I often spent my evenings with her as she was my neighbor. She's a mother of 3 in her 40s who moved into Italacan with her widowed mother and 4 siblings immediately after the earthquake when she was just a teenager. She explained to me that, quoting her, "Everyone has loans. They're in debt. They take one loan to go and repay another one. They take it from this bank and repay their debt to the other one because they don't have work," unquote. Again, referring to the temporary solutions to the daily hardships that are part of the post-earthquake, post-Soviet poverty. Besides borrowing money from the banks, people also borrow from one another. For example, instead of paying the full price for goods, customers can ask merchants for a payment plan without a definitive end pay update. On my second visit to Armenia in December, families were getting ready for Christmas gatherings. The father of a friend of mine who is involved in animal husbandry was quite busy selling pork, but he looked quite disappointed for a successful salesman. My friend explained that the customers did not pay up front. They promised him to pay back soon, and whatever that they did pay that day was just cigarette money for Dad. Due to these kind of exchanges, a steady and a stable income is not the reality in Spitak. The most predictable and stable income is government assistance for low-income families, which is not enough to support any family. Dahila was not receiving government assistance. She had an extensive employment history, working at many different jobs. She even plowed snow in the winter. In the summer, she was managing a group of ladies on a field. One day, Dahila abruptly lost her job as a result of a managing disagreement with her superior. She was sitting on the couch that evening and digesting what she called a sudden state of poverty. Without any savings or immediate job replacement, she did not have any other options but to be in that state. Because available jobs in Spitak are so rare, employers do not depend on any particular employee. Dahila was very quickly replaced by her neighbor. Such instability with income is why many individuals have to rely on government assistance or high-interest loans offered by private banks. Dahila was left to pay her loan interest and feed her children with no income or savings. My participants claim that this joblessness has impacted people's psychology, a concept that Dahila called the psychology of the poor. Elaborating, people have gotten used to poverty, dependency, waiting for someone to give bread to eat and to live. This is because there is nothing. There is no opportunities for work. There is no money, unquote. As a major contributor to the instability of daily life, money is always an issue and a determinant to how one perceives and deals with challenges. Such financial struggles also influence the survivor's feelings of loss. While another neighbor was speaking about the loss of her husband during the earthquake, she expressed guilt for being the parent who survived. She claimed that if her husband had been the one who had lived, as a man he would have been able to work and somehow get his family out of the temporary shelter and financial struggles. We can see how the experiences of the earthquake and its impact is contextualized in Armenia's political and economic history. Since the current life is filled with financial challenges and instability, Spitak's residents nostalgically remember the Soviet times. Now, people claim that nothing has changed, referring to the 32 years of temporary housing, unreliable work opportunities, and unstable financial circumstances. They feel as though they have not yet gone past the disaster recovery phase. The question then becomes, how does financial instability contribute to the sense of waiting for things to go back to normal? How does joblessness contribute to the shared consensus among the surviving communities that nothing has changed in the past 3 decades, and the communities have not yet recovered? I would like to analyze these questions through the concept of liminality and stuckness, frameworks within psychological anthropology. Overly simplified, liminality is often understood to be a middle or transitional phase, a physical or perceptual place where one is neither here nor there, but somewhere in between. This in-between phase is also associated with a state of temporariness. While one goes through a liminal phase, there is a sense of directionality towards where one is to end up. Thus, this liminal place is rarely a desired destination. Yet, this is exactly where my participants find themselves, in a liminal place, or a recovery phase. Although experiencing this transitional phase was an appropriate milestone in Spitak's recovery process, Survivors feel that they have not yet moved on from this state 32 years post-earthquake. So this prolonged experience of being in the in-between phase has been referred to in the liminality literature as perpetual liminality. It can be thought of as a lasting experience of in-betweenness, the word perpetual meaning never-ending or never-changing, and liminality referring to this in-betweenness or transitional phase. Spitak's community as a whole perceives to be stuck in recovery or in this perpetually liminal place. This particular feeling of stuckness can be thought of as the exact opposite to the sense of mobility or the feeling that one is going somewhere, going towards something. My participants have expressed feelings of existential immobility or the feeling of stuckness with the phrase that nothing has changed. They feel a sense of permanence in a recovery phase. This experience of perpetual liminality is associated with Spitak's political and environmental earthquakes. The findings of this study suggest that the temporal proximity of the disaster to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 created an economic stagnation through the production of poverty and joblessness. Spitak's inability to regain its economic stability after the earthquake is associated with the survivors' experiences of stuckness, a sense of immobility, or in a perpetually liminal place. People still have no jobs and there's still no factories. The community is not feeling a sense of movement towards its future. However, while my participants claimed to have no changes taking place within the last 3 decades, I was observing plenty of changes in their everyday lives, all somehow connected to financial struggles. This brings me to another form of liminality called transitional liminality. As opposed to perpetual liminality, transitional liminality is a sense of being in between an old and a new situation. Like Dahila explained, to repay one's loans, a person must take a new loan to repay the original one. So while a participant repays his debt to the first bank and exits old situation, he enters into a new situation by taking a loan from the second bank to repay the debt to the first bank. To elaborate, when looking at smaller social units, or the individual and the family, Spitak's residents are faced with daily financial challenges and changes that make them move from an old situation to a new situation, from an old crisis to a new crisis. Okay, so let's recap. I have been arguing that Spitak's inability to regain its economic stability after the earthquake is associated with survivors' experiences of being in a perpetually liminal place on the communal level, where surviving communities feel a sense of continuous stuckness in a recovery phase. Meanwhile, on the individual and familial level, people experience transitional liminality, where survivors often feel being in between an old and a new economically strenuous situation associated with financial instability. But we're not done yet. I further argue that it is the accumulation of constant changes on the microscopic or individual and familial level that keeps the community as a whole in a state of immobility, feeling stuck, thus creating the state of both change and no change, mobility and immobility, permanence and temporality, a paradox that makes development out of the recovery phase almost impossible. So why is it that Spitak's residents feel as if nothing has changed? Life in Spitak is always about survival. After surviving the shake, people are now left to survive poverty. Daily life is a mosaic, painted with daily challenges and changes. Jobs keep changing, sources of income keep changing, living situations keep changing, all due to financial struggles, and these daily changes contribute to the survival's feelings of no overall, large-scale community change towards its future. The findings of the study suggest the significance of co-events. Events are not singular. In this particular case, the fall of the Union impacted and reconfigured the experiences and perceptions of the impacts of the earthquake on people's everyday lives in Spitak, Armenia.